How you doing, guys? My name is Jim and I'm best known for my YouTube channel Adored TV, which focuses on PC technology. I got a bit bored of that recently though, so I decided to start a new channel dedicated to science and debunking conspiracy theories and superstition. The channel launched today. It is called Freethinker and you're watching it now. Now obviously, the major topic of last year, and probably going to be the major topic for 2021, is SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus, the virus which causes COVID-19, which has killed, as you watch this, almost 2 million people worldwide. And you might have thought that an invisible enemy killing off the old and infirm would bring all the people together as one, in order to combat it. But sadly, that is not what happened. In fact, the very same day the virus entered America, the conspiracy theories as to how and why it happened were already in full flow. That's for another video series though. Today I'll be concentrating on a few points which the anti-lockdown crowd use in their defence of what they call freedom, and some of their claims often seen on social media. The following discussions took place over about a week on Twitter at the beginning of 2021. Ivor Cummins at Fat Emperor on Twitter. Ivor has always been something of a fringe character in the science world, often seen promoting alternative solutions to health problems. By alternative I mean non-mainstream scientific opinion, but generally not the really crazy stuff like swallowing bleach, etc. Ivor's solutions tend to make sense at a certain level, like his promotion of the ketogenic diet for example. And of course, like any entrepreneur worth their salt, he has a website selling books on it. He also has a popular YouTube channel and a pretty large Patreon following. But Ivor didn't always have the popularity he has today. He really started to make it around April last year due to his beliefs on coronavirus and his anti-lockdown stance. We can see looking at his Twitter stats here, he was gaining on average just about 1,000 followers a month for years on end, all the way up to April last year. And then around May, the numbers started to explode upwards, adding 50,000 new followers between August and November last year alone. And it was around about this point that I started to get sick of seeing links and comments to his badly researched videos and articles on COVID. There will be a full video debunking Ivor entirely at some point in the future. But for now, I will start with the one comment I made, which kicked off the disagreement, which ended up with this video being made. I'm a Scotsman, but I live in Sweden. And after yet another one of Cummins' videos appeared on my Twitter feed, this time comparing COVID in Sweden to the Spanish flu of 1918, I just had to get involved. This video annoyed me for a few reasons. First of all, he compared less than 1 year of Swedish COVID to around about 2 years of Spanish flu deaths. Not a lot of people realise that, but Spanish flu lasted over the course of just under a couple of years, and it came in 3 waves. So I pointed this out on Twitter, and I also linked this research paper showing how that during the peak of COVID in New York, death rates were actually similar to the peak of Spanish flu. And actually, if you look at these numbers carefully, you can see that 100 years ago, all-cause mortality was around about 100 per 100,000 people in New York, whereas today it is as low as 50 people. And that's simply because medical care and health is better than it was 100 years ago. But for Spanish flu, the deaths peaked at almost 300 people per 100,000, whereas with COVID-19, they peaked at 200. But taking this all-cause mortality into consideration, then we can clearly see that Spanish flu and COVID-19 could have been pretty similar in death rate without the measures we took. And so that was my point. It was the lockdown which prevented it from becoming another 50 million plus death rate. And the paper explains perfectly how the stronger measures worked. It's safe to say that Ivor didn't really like that though. Utter bollocks and anti-science there. Thanks. And he linked to a website article suggesting that the opposite was true. Before I continue with the main points, a quick lesson here is that you should always vet sources, your own sources and other people's. And the first lesson here would be to simply look at the name of the website being linked. In this case, it is the American Institute for Economic Research. Now, if we go over to Wikipedia and the page that they have on this institute and have a look at their policy positions, AIER statements and publications portray the risks of climate change as minor and manageable. That's not a good start, at least not scientifically. I wonder what Ivor's position is on climate change. He doesn't do global warming stuff. A fence sitter. Curious. But getting back to AIER, and the institution has also funded research on the comparative benefits that sweatshops supplying multinationals bring to the people working in them. Nice. And they also issued a statement in October 2020 called the Great Barrington Declaration that argued for a herd immunity strategy to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, which was roundly condemned by public health experts. And as if that wasn't enough, they also paid for Facebook ads, promoting its articles against government social distancing measures and mask mandates. Now, you should never put blind trust in what you read on Wikipedia either. That is why each of these claims is followed by a citation. A number you can click on, this 19 here, which when you click on it, takes you to the bottom of the page. And now you can click on this link, which takes us to the site with the information. And now that we're here, we can just search for the word Facebook. Control F, Facebook. And according to the Facebook Advertising Archive, AIER launched a series of ads on the platform promoting its articles opposing lockdowns and mask mandates. And here we can see examples of those. So that is the kind of group that this guy Cummins uses as his anti-lockdown source. Climate deniers, herd immunity and sweatshop advocates. If anything is anti-science, it's this crowd. Now, Ivor has a very broad knowledge on the topic of COVID, which helps to give him an aura of authority, at least towards his followers who are easily dazzled by his fancy words and charts. He's also extremely prolific. He posts hundreds of tweets every day and apparently reads tens of research papers every day, but only ever those that support his own cause. One of his favourite points is that lockdowns simply harm the economy while doing nothing much to stop the spread of the virus. And as I live in Sweden, one of the few countries in the world that never had a hard lockdown, I am quite well placed to comment on our situation, simply because I'm paying that bit more attention to this country. And it was clear to me that Ivor was either making a rather large assumption on the effect of lockdowns on the economy, or he knows the real story but wasn't telling it to his legion of fans. Regardless of which one of those that is, my question to him was simple. Let's concentrate on Sweden. 20 times more deaths from COVID than Norway has, yet the Swedish economy performed worse. Explain that to me, Ivor. But after quite a long wait without any response, I decided to start for him. And as you can see here, I have linked both the Swedish and the Norwegian GDPs. And as we can see, in the second quarter, the Swedish economy contracted 7.5%, and then another 2.5% in the third quarter, whereas the Norwegian GDP only contracted 4% in the second quarter, and a very small 0.2% in the third. So as you can see, the Swedish economy contracted far worse. Yet Norway had a lockdown, and Sweden didn't. Again though, there was no answer for a very long time. And so, I continued to press the point. Explain to me how lockdowns are the cause of the economic chaos, when Sweden, with no lockdown, had twice the GDP contraction compared to Norway, who had a lockdown. And once again, there was no response. And so I pressed him for the final time. Come on, Ivor. Sweden, zero lockdown, twice worse economy drop than our closest neighbour who had lockdown. And Sweden also has 20 times more dead due to COVID. Why? How do you explain it? It's a really simple question. But all of that was to no avail. You see, when you're faced with someone like Ivor, who throws around so much pseudoscience, it is impossible to refute all of it. You need to concentrate on their main points and press them on those. Ivor never answered the question though, because he couldn't. And I knew he couldn't because Ivor can never be seen to be wrong on anything. But his followers saw this exchange, and they saw that he could not answer this very simple question. And that was the whole point of this exercise. But that's enough of Ivor, for now at least. For the last part of this video, I'll take a look at just how clued up Ivor's followers are. The amusing thing about these GDP numbers for Norway and Sweden that I had used was that previous to finding this website, I had actually been using outdated numbers. GDP is constantly updated through the year in revisions, as these numbers get a bit more accurate over time. And in the case of Sweden, the numbers were revised upwards twice, which means that this 8.3% contraction in GDP which I reported wasn't quite as bad as first thought. And this guy Andrew made sure that I knew all about it. As you can see here, I was actually responding to another tweeter who said that the Swedish economy did not suffer more. That was nonsense. And my response was showing him the outdated numbers. That was just a mistake on my part. And I used Norway, Denmark and Sweden for my point. I didn't bother with Finland as I thought the point was clear enough. Andrew, however, linked numbers for Sweden, Denmark and Finland. And if we use his full year GDP numbers, we can see simply by adding these up. So Sweden had a 0.6% growth in GDP in the first quarter, and then minus 7.5, minus 2.5 for the third, which is minus 9.4% for the first 3 quarters of 2020. Looking at Denmark, 0.1, minus 8, minus 3.7. So that's minus 11.6 for Denmark over those 3 quarters. Now looking at Finland, minus 1.3, minus 6.2, minus 2.7. And that's minus 10.2% over the 3 quarters. Now of course I mentioned Norway GDP, and while Andrew hadn't supplied the link to that in his tweet, that's a simple case of changing this word up here in the URL, Finland, to Norway. And Norway's 3-quarter GDP contraction is only minus 3%. And there's another simple lesson here that I hope everyone picked up on. Be very careful with people who change your data points or forget to add something. They almost always have a reason for doing so. And in this case, forgetting to add the link to Norway conveniently helped to support his point, which is otherwise known as cherry picking. But by this point, I'm thinking, yeah, okay, so Sweden has done very slightly better than Denmark and Finland, and a lot worse than Norway. My numbers were slightly off here, but the overall point hadn't really changed. The real point here is that Sweden, which had no lockdown at all, still had a pretty large GDP contraction. Why did that happen? The economic argument against lockdowns essentially state that people being stuck at home and unable to work is harming the economy, which is perfectly logical. If people aren't working, the economy will clearly suffer. So when the second quarter GDP figures came in, and almost everywhere was in the red, nobody was surprised. And all along, the assumption was it was the lockdown which caused the economic damage. Yet Sweden suffered pretty badly as well. Yeah, they've done a lot better than some of the larger European countries, but they've also done worse than a few, and Norway isn't even on this list. And I found this table of pandemic lockdowns over at Wikipedia again. Now taking a look through the list for some of those countries that I've been talking about, you can see Denmark here. That country had a 33-day lockdown between the 12th of March and the 13th of April. So that's only really a month of hard lockdown. And it's important to note that these third quarter numbers here don't really matter. The lockdown would actually only have affected 2 weeks at the end of the first quarter, the last 2 weeks in March, and then 2 weeks at the beginning of April. And looking at these numbers for Denmark again, 0.1% contraction in the first quarter, yet 8% contraction in the second? I mean, that's a bit odd, considering the lockdown was equally split between the first and second quarters, and yet the GDP was harmed far more in this second quarter, and it was the same everywhere. Now what about a country like Ireland? That had a 2-month lockdown, again starting on the 12th of March, but this time ending in the middle of May. And Ireland had good growth in the first quarter of 6% and a contraction of minus 3.2% in the second quarter. But they've done pretty well all year. 2 months of lockdown, only minus 3.2% GDP loss in this second quarter. Lockdown for 6 weeks out of 8 in this second quarter, and yet they had less than half the GDP contraction compared to Sweden, which had no lockdown. Now let's look for one more. Lithuania. 3-month lockdown they had between March again and June. And they only had a 4.6% contraction in GDP, even though they were locked down for the entire second quarter. But what about Spain and what about France and Italy, I hear? Look at how much worse they did than Sweden. and they had hard lockdowns. And that is true. And they were also hit extremely hard with deaths. And one of the reasons for that is that they are all heavily visited countries. France and Spain are in fact the number 1 and number 2 most visited countries in the world. Italy is 5th and the United Kingdom is 10th. And of course, those countries' economies are going to be hit harder during a pandemic which restricts international travel. World tourism was down 65% in the first half of 2020 and a massive minus 95% in that second quarter. And we can see here that Spain's tourism in the second quarter was wiped out entirely, 99.1% down. As for Sweden, yeah, they took a hit of 88.5% in the second quarter. But tourism is a very, very small part of the Swedish economy, something like 3% of the total economy. So that's not much of an excuse. And what's more, Norway did even worse in the second quarter, yet as we've seen, their economy suffered far less than Sweden's. Now, getting back to Andrew, who helped kick off this bit of research, he also managed to prove that this wasn't just a European thing. When he made the comparison between New York, which had a 3-month lockdown, and Florida, which only locked down for a month. And his own numbers tell it clearly. With New York and Florida having similar populations and similar tourism industry, New York's economy contracted 10.7% in the second quarter, compared to Florida's contraction of 8.6%. Now, if the major cause of economic damage was locking down, then surely these New York numbers of minus 10.7%, with a lockdown lasting 3 times longer, should have been nearer 3 times as bad as Florida's. But instead, you're only talking a couple of percent. An entire quarter locked down for a 10.7% contraction in GDP. And this economic argument was a gift it just kept on giving. Only last night, in a completely separate thread, somebody linked this image, showing the difference in policy between North Dakota and South Dakota. As we can see, North Dakota has masks and business restrictions. South Dakota didn't. And these COVID-19 cases per million are pretty similar. And by now you know where this is going. South Dakota's economy performed worse than North Dakota's, even without the business restrictions. These numbers here are annualised, which is why they're a bit different from the New York and Florida numbers. But simply put, we can quite clearly see South Dakota performed worse than North, even though the North had restrictions and the South didn't. So hopefully it should be clear to anyone that this is not a zero-sum game between lockdown and economy. It's not one or the other. And it appears that assumptions are being made that that is the case, while nobody bothered to look at the actual data. And based on the available data, it seems fairly apparent that it wasn't the lockdowns that caused the major economic damage. It was the virus. Again, nobody's saying that lockdowns don't harm the economy. Clearly they must do. However, it was the fear of the virus which kept people at home in that second quarter, regardless of whether they were allowed out or not. And this is just personal anecdotal evidence, but myself and my partner Jenny, we would go out to eat at least twice a month here in Sweden. Yet last year, we ate out twice in the entire year. Now, before I move on to the next discussion, there's something I just have to show you on this same topic of GDP. And during this discussion I was having with Ivor, another person, Basil Wood, he posted this tweet in response to my argument that the Swedish GDP had twice the contraction compared to Norway. And Basil's point was, twice you say? This comparison of your data on one chart reveals a lot about how you choose to interpret facts to fit your argument. How can that be? I now knew that the numbers I was using were accurate and up to date, yet here was Basil showing me a pretty clear chart from the same Trading Economics website that Norway and Sweden's GDP contractions were in fact much closer than my claims suggested. And the next lesson here? Really simple. If you're going to attempt to dismiss somebody's clear facts, especially when presented as links, you should at least try to find a chart where the numbers on the axes are consistent. Otherwise, Basil, you might just find a chart where the Swedish numbers end at -8 and the Norwegian numbers end at -6. So even though they look closer together on this chart, because of this -8 and -6, these numbers are actually still the same. Now moving on, to another tweet in this same discussion with Ivor. And smuggled John here with a couple of tweets which really brightened up my day. Jim, are you okay? Can you function as an adult? You missed the entire point. Maybe you can synthesize this since you can't do math, blah blah. And then the tweet which got me really excited was this one, complete with this graph. Take a good look and try to understand what makes a curve change. If a simple change in temperature can make a curve change, then why do masks have no effect? And looking at this really interesting chart, this was completely new to me, this one. But apparently, it's this change in temperature here. On the 9th of April, as the temperature reached higher than 55 degrees Fahrenheit, that triggered a lowering of deaths 14 days later. And this is in Massachusetts, 7 days rolling averages. Now, I'm just going to completely ignore this mask stuff for now. And we'll go to the other end of the year, the 26th of October, where we can see that when the temperatures dropped to below 55 degrees Fahrenheit, that triggered a rise in deaths. And that appears to be John's position, that coronavirus starts to die off quickly as the temperatures hit 55 Fahrenheit. But John, the human body is almost 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't you think? Never mind. Also, see this pattern here, which started on your chart around April. 55 degrees Fahrenheit? How come we see this pattern elsewhere, like almost everywhere else in the world? Take for example Spain, which has an average of 55 degrees Fahrenheit, not in April, but in the middle of February. So that must mean that Spain skipped COVID altogether, as those burning hot 55 Fahrenheit temperatures killed off the virus. But that's not really what happened, John, was it? In fact, Spain got hit one of the hardest countries in all of March. Worldwide, temperatures far above 55 Fahrenheit. I was scratching my head wondering what on earth possessed this guy to believe that 55 Fahrenheit was nearly enough to kill off this virus. Now, it is true that higher temperatures do help to break down viruses, but we're talking a lot higher than 55 Fahrenheit, which is only 13 degrees Celsius. In fact, we're talking temperatures more around 55 Celsius, which are required to effectively kill off SARS-CoV-2. And I would not be surprised if this is the mistake that John made, not realising the difference between Fahrenheit and Celsius when he reads the word degrees. If you think that sounds far-fetched, and nobody can be that dense, let me remind you of his claim. John started off feeling pretty smug, but for some reason, he didn't feel like continuing. Alright, that'll do us for now. I actually had another 2 or 3 points to bring up, but this video's going on long enough, so we'll have to wait for another day. But to recap this one, Ivor Cummins is spreading garbage about COVID, which has attracted a legion of denier fanboys. I called him out on his lockdown versus economy point multiple times, and he refused or couldn't answer the simplest question. And one of his fans, Andrew here, attempted to prove the point for him, but only ended up strengthening my point, that it wasn't lockdowns causing the economic drop, but the virus itself, fear of the virus. The only way to make Ivor's and Andrew's perspective fit is by making unfair comparisons, comparing countries like France and Spain to Sweden, with the former countries being affected far worse due to a much worse loss of tourism. Compare Sweden to other Nordic and Baltic area countries, shows that, in fact, Sweden, with no lockdown, fared just as poorly, or in some cases even worse, than its neighbours. And that came at a cost of 20 times more dead than our closest neighbours like Denmark, Norway and Finland. Next up, after accusing me of fudging the numbers, it turns out that Basil here had the faulty graph and my numbers were legit. And then we had John. If only logic had guided John at any point in his life, he would never have believed anything as absurd as this chart. And all of that was just a very small section of one Twitter thread. Imagine how much logically devoid, anti-scientific bullshit that this platform spews out on an average day. I'm done for now. Check the video description for links to my stuff, and you can follow me on Twitter, etc. And I'll catch you later.